You are listening to the Earplug Podcast Network, a Fanboys Inc. production.
If you're passionate for what you love and you're serious about it, when you see our cameras at the show, then we want to talk about it. Fair weather fans need not apply. We seek nerds that are true.
All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to celebrating Jack Kirby. This would have been his 100th year if he was still with us today. And pleased and excited to have Mr. Roy Thomas here. So let's hear for Roy Thomas. So Roy will be able to give us some insight into the world of Jack Kirby, whereas myself, my name is Matt Herring. I am the co-host of the Secret Identity podcast, which we've been doing for 12 years, almost 800 episodes. Thank you to the guy who was in like episode 8. And about episode 8, and we are winding down on episode 800 and doing a music podcast because talking about comic books is great, but 12 years of it has been a little much. And we are starting to wind down a little bit right there. But when I was asked to come up and moderate this panel about Jack Kirby, I was ecstatic. My introduction to Jack Kirby goes back to 1975. I was probably 7, 8 years old, and my parents used to bribe me with comic books to be good in church, to do good in school, and to do stuff around the house.
Sweet!
And I was a big war comics guy. So the first time I ever saw Jack Kirby's work was in our Fighting Forces 154, which was Bushido. And it was when the losers ended up getting dropped into a Pacific island, and they had to go kill a guy. Or they had to go take out an officer, and they insulted him. All sorts of crazy things happened. But that was my first introduction to Jack Kirby, and what I loved about it was, as a young kid, having any frame of reference, because there was no web, there was no nothing. I remember thinking, wow, this Jack Kirby guy's pretty good. I think he's going to have a good career. Not realizing that he was already 30, 40 years into his career. It was his second stint at DC. Which had a lot of just amazing stuff right now. But Roy, I will ask you, since, has anybody here met Jack Kirby before? All right, so we're going to go right to Roy. What was it like when you first met Jack Kirby?
Well, the funny thing is, I remember the day I met a number of people, Stan Lee, sort of Steve Ditko, John Romita, Bill Everett, and a lot of different people, but I don't remember the exact day I met Jack Kirby. The only thing I can be sure about is it was on a Friday. Because Friday was the day that Jack, who lived out on Long Island, would come into Manhattan, usually delivering some work. And he and Stan would often go out to lunch, or sometimes they even drove home together. Stan would drive and Romita might be in the car or whatever. And he would be, sometimes he would go out to lunch with some of the rest of his production manager, Saul Brodsky, John Romita, myself, one or two other people might be around. I was the kid of the group. The rest of them were all seasoned pros. Once in a while, Stan would join us and so forth. And but I don't remember the exact day. I just remember, I was really impressed because since the age of about 5 or 6 or 7, somewhere back in there, one of my right after Joe Kubert. My favorite artists in comics were whoever Simon and Kirby was, that was one guy or 2 guys or 12 guys or whatever it was. I didn't know what it was, but I just knew that whatever their names were on a story was pretty exciting. Yeah. Just like with Kubert's name and so forth, it had a certain dramatic look. And the Simon Kirby stuff was very exciting, and it was always of interest no matter what the subject matter was, it seemed to me. And so it was fascinating to me to actually, meet this person, because by now I even had much greater appreciation for him than I had back in the late 40s when he was doing stuff like Stuntman and things that, they were good comics, but they weren't going to add to his luster the way Captain America had, or the way that the Marvel and so forth stuff would later on. But he was a nice, amiable person. Very kind of friendly and outgoing. I mean, when you looked at him fondly, very quickly figured that he wasn't really giving away too much. He was, he was a little guarded, but he was, friendly, and he was just glad to, very unpretentious. He'd been around a long time. He'd been up and he'd been down, and he was sort of up then, and being up was better.
What year about was this?
This would have been in '65 because I went to work there in the summer of '65, and somewhere in that first 2 or 3 weeks I would have met Jack.
So that was in the time when he and Stan still had the good working relationship. He was still kind of the guy at Marvel.
When I came in there, of course other things were in the stands, but some of the first stuff that I was seeing was those first couple of 2 or 3 of those stories that were slowly introducing the Inhumans. And it was right before, it was 2 or 3 months before the Galactus trilogy started, and even more before Black Panther. So it was really where it was really beginning to build to a real height. Not that I necessarily, that anybody really knew that at the time, but it was really coming close to the peak of their work. Obviously, there were strains, and within a very few months, I saw those strains, especially when this article came out at the turn of 1966 with the New York Herald Tribune, where the reporter made it look like Stan was everything, and it made Jack look like just some clown, and the reporter somehow, because Jack didn't say that much, he somehow assumed that Jack wasn't contributing that much to Marvel, and he was just some guy who did whatever Stan told him to do. And unfortunately, Stan kind of took the rap for that, and everything from Jack and Roz, who somehow felt that Stan was trying to grab credit away from him, and that Stan could do that, but he wasn't doing it in this instance.
Yeah, and when you look back at that...
I was in part of that conference. I was a first-hand witness to some of it, and the way the guy described it was just his interpretation. I don't think it had any objective reality to the situation.
And obviously, you were there, we weren't, and when we read about it years later, Stan Lee, as we all know, and I'm a marketing major, and Stan Lee is one of those guys you look at like Gene Simmons of Kiss, that they know how to market what they're doing. It could be garbage, and you know what? He's going to put such a spin on it. Gene Simmons is going to put such a big spin on it. And like you said, it seemed like Jack never, if you don't say anything, you're basically not getting any credit for what you did.
Yeah.
And it definitely, you read it now and you're like, I can see where the misconception happened, where the disconnect happened, but it's such a sad time. But at the same time after that, he went to DC and sort of unloaded a lot of books that weren't really that popular at the time, but nowadays, DC would not have their mythos right now if it wasn't for what Jack set up with the New Gods and all of that stuff. And on the outside, what were your thoughts of seeing Jack's work at DC?
I wasn't that wild about it. I mean, I obviously admired the artwork and the inventiveness of coming out with all these characters, but it just seemed like a mishmash to me, very disorganized, just throwing out so many things that it was the fault, and of course there was the genius with it, but the thing that was wrong with them was that he didn't have anybody in charge of it. Before he had Simon, who was a talented guy enough on his own. He wasn't Jack Kirby, but he was a talented enough guy. He was the business guy. He kind of reined Jack in. And when Stan was sort of like that, Jack himself was just a wild man. I remember, for example, and this relates to the New Gods, so it's not unrelated, that back when there's a S.H.I.E.L.D. story that somewhere in the first couple of pages, you'll probably remember, there's a great big, I don't know if it's a full page or 2/3 of a page panel of some robot, S.H.I.E.L.D. robot in a story that Jack penciled. They called Wild Bill or something. It's just some multi-armed robot going around doing crazy stuff. And you turn the page, wanting to see more of what this robot does. Nothing. Jack just drew one panel, this robot, got it out of his system, and never drew it again. It might as well have been a page that he just, threw in from that he had done 20 years before. And Stan was always going crazy with it because Jack would throw these things in, and then he wouldn't develop them, and so forth. And Stan knew that you need to develop stuff and make readers really, want to see more of it, and then show them a little more of it. And when he got to DC, he had nobody to rein him in. They were just giving him his head. They had decided in their own minds that the sole genius of Marvel was Jack Kirby. The Stan was, and of course, maybe Jack believed this, and of course they played it up to Jack, that he was the whole show, and Stan was simply, writing him and taking all the credit and so forth. And of course, Stan's promoting himself a lot, and sometimes more than the artist for various reasons, partly personal, partly because if you promote one artist, the other artists then feel kind of, they feel put aside. So there were maybe some good reasons for some of that. But then Jack is just throwing out all these ideas. He'll throw out 4 or 5 ideas in one story, the Deep Six, and this and that. And then the next issue, you don't see any sign of them. You see a bunch of new guys. And It doesn't work that way, as I discovered when I was doing All-Star Squadron, and I'd get bored with doing a couple of characters, and I'd do somebody else, and as a result, the readers don't grab onto the characters as much, but at least I was kind of doing it on purpose. I think Jack was just doing it because he was an elemental force, and that there was nobody to rein him in, and I think he needed some reining in.
I always looked at...
But they were brilliant things in their own way.
I always looked at Stan and Jack sort of kind of going into the music world like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, that together they were unstoppable, and whether or not one did all the song, but they both got credit, and one would always be able to help reel in somebody else. John would tell Paul, that's pretty corny, you gotta do something a little bit different. Paul would say, John, that's way too political, you gotta do something to kind of smooth it out a bit. And then when they were apart, they had nobody to tell each other what they were doing.
Yeah, I still like work by both of those guys, but I don't like it nearly as much as when they were together, even if I know that sometimes it was all Lennon and probably more often it was all McCartney.
Yeah.
But the fact remains they were sort of there for each other, and they were part of a group and so forth. And it didn't matter exactly which one did it so much as the fact that they were inspiring each other, or they were sort of acting as both an inspiration and a break on each other. And so that Stan and Jack do have a certain vague resemblance to Lennon and McCartney. I was more like Ringo. You know?
And another thing that I think about with Jack Kirby was when he went back to Marvel, probably 77, 78.
No, it was about 75, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, because
it might have been dated 76, but he was starting with the stuff starting around 75.
That was Captain America, the Mad Bomb, and all that stuff was coming out. And
because Jack he and his son, and maybe somebody else, had asked to meet with me in 1974 at the San Diego Comic Convention, because already, and by this time he's been at Marvel, at DC, 3-4 years, 70 to 71, and that's 74, and he wanted to talk about coming back to Marvel. This is a year before he actually did.
Wow.
And he talked to me about it, and so forth. So, I mean, that's why I know that it was like the next year, at 75, that he actually did it.
And
so his DC thing didn't last too long.
No, and like you were saying, he was just putting out stuff like crazy. And then I remember when reading the stuff at Marvel, like I was reading Captain America. Do we have any like Captain America fans from the 70s that can remember any of those crazy arcs?
Mad Bomb?
Mad Bomb, right into the Alamo 2 thing, right into Arnim Zola.
And let's not forget the Black Panther coming on with King Solomon's Frog.
Yes, King Solomon's Frog. We had the Swine, and it was like, when you read these things, and you could even throw that Black Panther arc in there, you could have pretty much put any superhero, any character into these stories. It almost to me seemed like Jack had the story of some superhero is going to get caught in Central America and be captured by a guy named the Swine. Arnim Zola is going to be in the swamp right next to him. It could have been anybody. Did you see or think anything like that? Like the Elementals could have been, to me it was the New Gods, but Marvel. And was a lot of that going on, or did you see that? Like it was just, here's my story, I'm just going to throw whatever character I'm on.
Well, I was partly responsible for him being on Black Panther, for example, because that book wasn't going anywhere in terms of sales. I know that Don McGregor poured his heart and soul out to it. He and Butler working on these rather adult storylines, but it didn't ever sell very well. And when I think it was Jerry Conway, during the 37 minutes that he was the editor-in-chief, he was asking me for a little advice, because I helped him get that job at the time, even though it didn't last that long. He quit it, and so he was saying, was asking for some advice, and he was talking about the Black Panther, and I said, yeah, it's not going anywhere. Why don't you just put Jack on it and see what happens? And that didn't work out that well, but it didn't work out anywhere sales-wise than it was doing before. It's just a shame that by the time he came back, Jack was just, he wasn't like running on empty, but he was just kind of coasting and so forth. And it's not like he didn't come up with some interesting ideas, but it wasn't the same Jack Kirby that it had been even though he was doing full plotting on a lot of, especially the later stuff with Stan, it was really his stories in a lot of ways that Stan was happy to have it be that way. He didn't care, he just wanted the books to be good. He was happy to just do the dialogue, and if Jack did something he didn't like, he'd tell him and we'd fix it later on. But the trouble is, when he came back, Stan didn't have that kind of direct contact with him anymore. I mean, that bond was broken in 1970 when Jack called him coldly one day just to say, I'm quitting and I've already started working for DC. That's not the way you tell somebody that you're quitting if you ever think about you might want to come back. Which is why when in '74, when I had this if you don't mind me talking about it.
Please do.
The lunch I had in San Diego with the Kirby family, it was his son, what was his son's name? Neil. There might have been one other member of the family there, I don't think so. I don't think Roz was there. But anyway, so it was at least 3 of us. And I didn't know that I was only a couple of weeks away from quitting being editor-in-chief myself, so that really was not a factor. But they asked to meet with me, and I said fine. And the things I remember about it is, Jack was very friendly because, I was still in awe of Jack, despite the fact that I had been that wild with the New God stuff and everything. And I was getting the feeling he wasn't that happy. Obviously then you go to Commanding the Demon. This is not the same inspired stuff as the New Gods was. It was a step down for Jack, even if it in some ways was maybe more successful. And he starts saying, well, I don't know, I just haven't been really, that happy there. Made some mumbling sounds, says, and what would Stan think, you think, if I want to come back? I had no question. He wasn't really talking to me so much. I'm officially the editor-in-chief, but Stan was still there. He would make the ultimate decision as the publisher. And so I said, Jack, I said, Stan would really like you back. He obviously never wanted you to leave. I wasn't going to point out that he wasn't given any choice. But I said, he never wanted you to leave. I said he'd be overjoyed to have you come back. I said, the only thing in the way, because, really, I said he was kind of hurt and bothered when you did this funky Flashman stuff in that one title where you made a character who was a rather vicious, I'm just honest with Jack, I didn't know him well, but I'm going to tell him the truth because I knew how Stan had felt about it. I says, now you had this character called House Roy. He says, I didn't mind about that because I didn't feel you were really aiming that at me. I was just Stan's flunky and this and that, and okay, so I am Stan's flunky or whatever. And House Roy is a clever name. I didn't really mind that much. And I was almost a sympathetic character, but it was such a nasty lampoon of. And Jack gives this nervous little laugh, says, well, it was all in fun. And I had to pretend to let that go because if there was one thing I was sure about, it was that Funky Flashman was not all in fun. It was Jack, it was his repressed feeling, the closest he could come to slugging Stan in the nose. And, but I pretended to believe that it was all in fun and just let that go. And I said, I'm sure we can arrange something. And it took a little while. I don't know if Jack got cold feet and everything and didn't approach it, but suddenly several months later, by this time I've quit. Stan and I are, on good terms once we weren't arguing over things anymore. And so I came in one day, as I did 2 or 3 days a week, to check things out. And by that time, Len and Marv or different people were in charge. I forget how it was that week. And Stan calls me in and says, listen, I got news. Jack's coming back. Of course, he knew that I had talked to him, so it wasn't any surprise. He went to tell me about it. Says, well, that's great. Says, I think we can get him come back. He's interested in coming back. And I said, so he says, what do you think about it? I said, I said, have him come back. Don't let him write. I didn't mean plot. I mean, write the dialogue because he just really didn't have it for our audience. And Stan said, well, Jack says if he comes back, he has to write. I said, okay. So I think, well, let him write. I said, it's still better to have him at Marvel than it is to have him at DC, because he might do something well for Marvel. You never can tell DC. He just belongs at Marvel at the stage. He doesn't belong at DC. He never really fit there. Get him back, find something to do if he has to do it. And he says, well, that's the way I'm thinking, but I've got it. He didn't ever tell me who. I don't know if it was Marvel. I doubt it. There's a couple of people around there, prominent people, at least on the staff, people he whose opinions he sort of respected up to a point. He said, told me that they really just don't think I should get Jack back. And I said, I won't say the exact word, I said, they're crazy. And, I said, ignore them. I said, just get Jack back. I said, okay, well, that's what I was going to do. I wasn't under any illusion that I was convincing Stanley to get Jack Kirby back, but I was kind of glad to see that I was more in sync with him than some of the members of his staff, and even though it didn't last but a couple of years, because then they wanted him to sign the work for hire kind of thing, and Jack wouldn't do it, the fact remained that even having him back for that 2 or 3 years, he did, the Eternals was a kind of an interesting series, and there were moments, certain things in Captain America and Black Panther, even if they weren't exactly vintage Kirby, I kept hoping that they'd find some way to really, harness Jack in some good way, but the Eternals is the closest that I think Jack ever came to do anything at close to the level of New Gods or the later Lee Kirby. Right?
His stuff definitely when he was writing, I remember as a kid, I would tell my mother, my dad would never quite, he would know if I would tell my parents, if one of them went shopping, like, can you go get me one of those adventure comics? And what I was trying to say was war comics. I didn't, because that was what I was reading at the time. But I would say adventure comics. My dad would always come home with GI Combat, Unknown Soldier, Sergeant Rock, Sergeant Fury. But my mother would always come home with literally an adventure comic like Justice Incorporated, which was all this stuff that Jack Kirby was doing. And I remember opening up, and every time I'd read, and it would be like, edited and written and drawn by Jack Kirby. The stories were very easy to digest for a young kid. I was probably 8 or 9.
Yeah.
So that was why I think a lot of the Captain America stuff really appealed to me back then. Arnim Zola, Doughboy, was this big doughy thing that would emball you, and then you had oxygen, and it was just like the weirdest stuff. But as like an 8-year-old kid, I'm like, this is awesome. It's like he's inside of it, and you know, there's a window, and it's a window because Doughboy can make himself transparent. Like, it's like, what is this crazy stuff? But it was a lot of fun. But I do understand now, when you're looking back and wanting to match the Lee and Kirby of that first 50, 60 issues of Fantastic Four. When you think about Jack Kirby now, and this whole run in his history, what are some of those things that maybe jump out to you, like his biggest projects, or what is it that really stands out?
A handful of things. Captain America, because even if it was Joe Simon's idea, without Jack Kirby, we'd just as soon be remembering the Shield or Captain Freedom or something,
Yeah.
you know. There are other really good things like Stuntman, but as far as in Green Heart, some of that stuff. But the next thing to me, it jumps despite the fact that I would pick up Simon and Kirby things for it. It jumps all the way to the day I saw Fantastic Four #1 on the stands, because I had been seeing all these monster things, and I knew it was Kirby, and I didn't know. I guess this is half of Simon Kirby. Maybe Simon did some good stuff too, but I didn't like that kind of material, so I never bought a single one of those things ever. But and everything. I got a new Stan Lee's name on it, Jack Kirby. I wasn't going to buy it. And then the day Fantastic Four #1 came out, I bought 2 copies of it, you know, and so forth, because I felt like this could really be something just looking at it. It had some excitement about it. When I read it, I realized that I had done a wise thing.
Oh yeah.
But and then from there on, I mean, I don't know, just you know, you can. The height of his, not right away so much at the beginning, but a few years in, when he really reached his plateau on Fantastic Four and Thor around the same time, with that great Thor, Pluto, Hercules, and he did a couple of stories around that, and a couple of other things. And I have to read, as a to me, somewhat diminished peak, others think differently, I would say the Fourth World material at DC still had enough going in for it that you could say this is still a major, you know, plateau or a minor mountain in Kirby's career. After that, I don't think there's anything. Despite Eternals is the closest you come, you know, as far as I'm concerned. But that's just, you know, me as a reader and as a long time fan of Jack Kirby.
And being a huge fan of yours when I was growing up and reading The Invaders, because that was, to me, the perfect comic of, I got my war stuff, I got my Nazis getting beaten up,
Yeah.
and then I had Captain America. And my first time I ever
I
saw
wish there
Captain
were more
America.
like you. There were some, but they're not quite
My
as good as I hoped.
My first issue of The Invaders I ever bought, or the first time I ever saw Captain America, I'm going to say, other than the Mego action figure, was The Invaders #1. And I was there buying every single one of them, and then all of a sudden I remember probably maybe issue 2, I don't think he did the first cover.
No, Robbins and Bermuda did the
Yep.
first cover.
And then I think it was like 2 to about 12 or 13.
It was Jack.
I remember
Yeah.
getting those covers going, oh, that's the guy who did our Fighting Forces featuring the Losers, that new guy.
Yeah.
That was coming out.
Well, I found out, you know, Jack, and I was thinking, you know, I said, can I get Kirby to do them, you know, and everything. So Jack was right out, and I didn't ever see him, but we were both in California. I would just call him up and get him to do the covers. As long as I could get Jack Kirby to do the covers of Invaders, I was going to do it. I could have got him to do a whole issue. Well, see, when I was going to come back in this is an interesting thing. When I was going to come back in '76 for that week or so before I reneged on it, and was going to become the editor-in-chief the second time after Marv and Len were both leaving, you know, leaving at least being, you know, the full editors. I was trying to figure out a way to get Jack back, because he was back by that time, early '76. So I had this idea, you know, since Stan was knocking himself upstairs and everything like that, and trying to keep out of the stuff, I decided I would write Fantastic Four, which I had written, you know, not a little bit before, and I would get Jack to work with me on it, And I had a great plan, which I tried to, I would have Jack do the plots and get credit for the plots. I mean, I'd guide him as the editor, because I'd be the editor and the scripter. But I could give him even first credit, because since he was doing the plot, that's part of the writing, it wouldn't disturb the kind of balance, and all of a sudden you'd have writers and artists argue about which one's name came first and so forth. But I said if Jack did the plot first, then that as the Johnny Storm
Was
character.
that number 12?
10, 11, 12, I don't know, somewhere in here. But anyway.
That's sad that I'm remembering.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so, and I said, look, Stan will be Mr. Fantastic, you'll be the Thing, and if Jack had wanted to change it, could have. I said, and I'll be the Johnny Storm, and Flo Steinberg, who wasn't around really anymore, but just because she had been there would be that. And Jack said, great. And I was originally going to dialogue, but then I decided, that I wasn't sure about it. And then it comes in, and Jack double-crossed me. Instead of having me be a character in it, and I remember I'm going to be the editor, so I could have, made him change this again or whatever. I could have refused to accept it. He had made Saul Brodsky the Johnny Storm Human Torch character, but then I got to thinking about it. I said, this really makes a lot of sense. Saul Brodsky, although he's not known that well to the readers, was around. He was the production manager, and he was the guy who inked Fantastic Four numbers 3 and 4. He was around earlier than I was with Flo and with Stan and Jack. So I said, I said, I'll just let Jack, just write the whole thing. I had no more interest in writing it then, but I figured I'd let it go. And that sort of became the last, not counting something they made out of the animated stuff, but that became the last Fantastic Four story in essence that Jack ever really did and everything. But I'm kind of proud that I got him to do one last Fantastic Four story, even though God knows I had trouble steering that through Stan, because for one thing, for some reason, Stan Lee, once Stanley Lieber became Stan Lee, Stan Lee did not like being called Stanley, and that had been his name, and he's not ashamed of it. He says that he writes it himself, but he didn't like it, and Jack loved to call him Stanley, and I think he just did it because he knew, I think in his heart he knew Stan didn't care much for being called Stanley. So all the way through that Fantastic Four story and What If, every time Jack, sits there, he called him Stanley. And Stan, he wanted to see that issue. He didn't ordinarily pay much attention. He looked at it. He wasn't that happy with it. You had the S people who turned out to be the Skrulls. That wasn't too great an idea. But the only thing Stan really had me change, because otherwise it's just Jack, what are we going to do? And, but he said, I want all those Stanleys changed to Stan. Because I would have left them all. I would have loved it. I thought it was just great. Why not? Why call him Stan? That's the way Jack addressed it. Yeah. So it would have been realistic. But Stan was very sensitive on that touch, and he felt that was his prerogative, that it was just going to be Stan and not Stanley. And he was Stan Lee now, and he wasn't going to be Stanley. So that was the end of the relationship. Then, of course, soon after that, Jack was gone. But he was always a nice enough guy. There's a lot of hostility in him in general, and toward toward Stan, and before that toward Simon, all his partners, toward Carmen Infantino, I think at a certain stage too, who had been the guy who had brought him over to DC. But I think Jack was one of these guys, whenever he got a partner or somebody he was working with, it was inevitable that before long he would get to hate him. Because Jack was such an unfettered kind of guy in his mind, but he was not a confrontationalist. He wouldn't, I don't know how he ever was with Simon, probably the same, but he wouldn't stand up to Stan. He wouldn't stand up to Carmine. He kind of took it, was polite, and then he went, home and released an atomic explosion in his mind. And I remember that when Gil came to this very historic interview that was published in my early alter ego, I guess number 10, it came. I don't know if you remember, it was really a major interview for the time. Gil talking not about his own work, but about the field and so forth, and talking about Jack. And he took a few quotations out of it, that the interview he did with John Benson, that he would not let be used. And a couple of my favorites, one was about Joe Kubert. He would say, well, Joe Kubert says he has a certain yellow belly attitude. I thought that was toward he didn't feel he was adventurous enough. Yeah. He said, because if I draw a rock, or Jack Kirby draws a rock, it's a rock. It's got some farm. If Kubert draws a rock, it'll be a farmless, meaningless rock. And I saw it, and I thought, is that right? I picked up a copy of Tarzan, and I don't remember, but when Tarzan goes to the city of Opar, there's a big rock he stands on, before he looks at Opar that Joe drew in a big panel. It is the most formless, meaningless rock. It might as well be a balloon. You know, there is no stoneness to it. And the other quote, though, was getting to Jack, was he had a wonderful image for Jack, which he then would not allow, once he thought he was going to maybe have to go back to the comics field after the failure of Savage and all. He would not allow to be in the thing. And that was, he says, Jack, he says, lives for that drawing board. He says, every evening, about the end of the day, Roz, his wife, comes and wheels him and his drawing board into the closet where Jack sits and vibrates until morning. And then wheels him out again. Now that was just, a caricature drawing, but it is true that Jack sort of lived at that board, and and he would talk about being confrontational, and I'm sure he was probably a scrapper as a kid. It's not like he didn't have any guts or anything, because he had plenty, but he was so determined to. He just wanted to make money for his family and support himself. He would never take a chance. You had to take more of a chance. He would only quit Marvel when he actually had another job waiting for him. I've been the same way myself, so I'm not begrudging Jack that. But I'm just saying that he would act like he was confrontational and so forth, but he wasn't. Never was.
We were talking about the Invaders and how you were saying how you'd love to have had him draw some.
Oh yeah.
He was in one issue though, the reprint issue of number 10.
Well,
the Reaper.
That wasn't by Jack.
That wasn't Jack? I
No,
thought that was...
No, that's later. That's not Jack.
That wasn't a reprint of Jack's Cap stuff?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a later story. What happened is that guy, and there's this guy in Canada, remember, anybody heard Captain George? He's dead now, George Hennessy. He was a guy in Canada who had run into a lot of photostats or whatever of Marvel stuff that they had shipped there to be published during the Second World War, and that was left. He published it, even though it actually was technically owned still by Marvel, but he published a lot of that stuff. So it was one of the early ways, the only ways we had any, it's the only stuff we had any black and whites on where we could get really good reproduction of that early stuff. But this was not Simon and Kirby. The Simon and Kirby stuff was in Fantasy Masterpieces.
Yeah,
that was all traced. That was all redrawn and rather mediocrely put back together. But that other story, The Reaper, that was 2 or 3 other artists. I don't know who it was exactly, but it wasn't Jack.
And it was something.
Jack was a DC at that time.
And it was because it was a reprint. It was, if you remember that.
Oh, it was a reprint.
There was a lot. Did anybody read The Invaders? So there was a lot of those issues where you would have the story, and then because of one thing or another, they'd throw a reprint in there. And with the Reaper one issue,
that was me.
That was you?
That was me.
I
had gone through a divorce. I'd left New York, come out to LA, La La Land, trying to get a new life of every kind going and so forth. And, it's a different, and I wanted to write what I had to write, but I just really wasn't in it as much as I had been for a while. And so as a result, I kind of fall behind, and I had some stuff that I could sort of find ways to, and it wasn't quite just throwing in a recent reprint, it would be a story kids hadn't seen.
Oh yeah, that was stuff I never saw before, where Captain America mentioned something, thank you, about the Reaper.
Yeah.
And then they would, it was 2 pages because Spitfire was shot.
Yes.
And they had to transfer blood to her.
Well, while we're doing it, let's tell a story about what happened in 1943.
And that was exactly it. They're like, oh, she's at death's door, the Reaper's going to be in a minute. And then Cap goes, that reminds me of the story about the Reaper. And then you had a reprint.
Yeah. Which is funny because it was probably about a 42 or 43 story, remembering, and the comic book took place in 42, so who wasn't exactly remembering the age.
It was so good. So, as we're talking about Jack Kirby, does anybody have any questions? I don't want to monopolize all of this time with Roy. I could easily do it. So
I'm not an expert on Kirby, but I did personally know him, and I, admire his for so many years. So I feel like
Other than what you said, are there any other anecdotes you can share about Kirby, or?
If I think of anything, if somebody asks me something, maybe I'll think of something. If something occurs to me, I'll throw it in. I've thrown in most of them, but there are a few others. I never spent a lot of time, with Jack. I mean, it was mostly in the company of others. I do remember one day at lunch, Stan wasn't there this time, but or he probably wouldn't have said it quite this way, but it was probably me and Ramita and John Buscema, maybe Stan Goldberg, a couple of people from the office, but most of the old guys and me as the 24, 25-year-old youngster or whatever. And he's sitting there, and one day somebody was asking, what do you think will be next, Jack? Everybody's always looking for a trend. He says, I don't know. He says, but he says, one thing I know. He says it won't be me, and it won't be Stanley. It's going to be two kids in a garage somewhere. I think he was thinking like himself and Simon, two kids that arrive somewhere are going to come up with something. And I thought that when I think of things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles things, I know basically is exactly what Jack said, that it'll just come out of nowhere. If you could predict where it's going to come out of, you could control it and be rich. Yeah. And nobody knows where it's going to. Who knew where Jack Kirby was going to come from? Yeah. I mean, even Stan just stumbled into suddenly having the greatest comic book action artist of all time working for him for cheap wages, simply because he had been in a lawsuit with a DC editor who was so vengeful that he got him blacklisted from DC Comics. With only 2 or 3 companies in the field, Jack was forced into coming back to Timely for these cheap rates. And Mark Evanier, in his book on Kirby, there's not that much in it that's really new of the first. It's a good enough little book. But there's the end of the chapter, and I quote this in the Stan Lee book I'm writing for Tasha Publishers that'll finally, hopefully, come out next year. I finished my part of it long since. But at the end of one chapter, somebody supposedly asked, the artist Mike Sikowski, who drew Justice League for years, and had worked for Time, he says, somebody asked him, he said, who won the lawsuit between Jack Schiff, that was the DC editor, and Jack Kirby? And Sikowski said, Stan Lee. Which is, I think, one of the most profound things that Sikowski or anybody else ever said about the field. And when you combine the fact of Jack being at Stan's mercy in a sense, at the same time that he was one of the 2 or 3 artists that Stan most admired, even then, he had Manili, who was dead, and there was Jack, and I don't know if there was any third person, really, at that stage. And when you combine that and then, the rise of Ditko just happening to be there, you suddenly had, you can't describe it any better than to say it was a perfect storm.
Oh, yeah.
That happened, that nobody could have controlled, nobody could have predicted. And that's why everybody keeps trying to explain it, because everybody says it was all Stan Lee. Stan says that sometimes. and some people fervently believe it was all Jack Kirby, which is at least equally ridiculous, and so forth. And what it really was just some particular combination of things that, just the same way that The Wizard of Oz turned out such a good movie when, even though you had second choices and different things in several of the roles, and it wasn't Shirley Temple, and it wasn't W.C. Fields, and it wasn't even the guy who was going to play the Tin Woodman originally. Buddy Ebsen. It wasn't, it was a whole second choice of people, and it ended up being a wonderful movie. Just sometimes these things work out in spite of you. Sometimes they work out bad, sometimes they work out good. Marvel was a place where they worked out good.
So if I learned one thing today in this panel, that Buddy Ebsen was the choice of the Tin Man?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Oh yeah, he did some tests. I forgot the name for that, but he did tests, and it turned out he was very allergic or something to the kind of paint they had to put on. There was and so forth, so they had to replace it with Haley, who never did anything else, particularly in movies. Everybody knows him. I guess he was in a couple of roles, but he had no great career like Ray Bolger and Lair and so forth, and Judy Garland and Frank Morgan for that.
Wow, see, let me write that one down.
These people, they all know this. You're just behind the curve.
Yes.
How was the deal brokered? The rumor, from what I understand, Neil Adams was involved and others in the industry to get Kirby credit and his family monetary reimbursement.
You mean just a few years ago?
Yeah, well, I heard there were a few different actions over the years.
I'll tell you the truth, I really don't know much about it. Okay. I did a deposition, not for or against Kirby, because I wasn't, thank heaven, I wasn't involved in having to come down the side or things the way that I would get caught with, like with Marv Wolfman on Blade or Gerber on Howard the Duck or my friend Gary Friedrich on Ghost Rider. With Jack, I was just there for a little, as an expert, somebody who was around in 1965 and so forth and who could report on a few things. So I really don't know much about how it went. I don't know anything about, I mean, Neil was always kind of a crusader rabbit for whatever cause he got interested in. And of course his main success was the Siegel-Schuster thing, which he and Jerry Robinson and people engineered. And maybe it had something to do with Jack. It's not certainly beyond the pale of thought. I just don't know anything about it. I wasn't really involved in it at all. I just went and did my deposition, and I don't even remember what I said there.
Thank you.
I think it's a fairly important question. First of all, you blew out of the water to talk about any kind of controversy with Kirby or being kind of unrented. Obviously, that wasn't true. My question is, everybody knows that, let's be honest, a lot of comic book artists will copy Kirby in terms of his anatomy, in terms of the way he made the men and the women look. My question is, Mr. Thomas, did he ever talk to you about that? Did you ever, when he was doing thick looks on the easel, did he ever mention about what he thought was important with anatomy, or how he got the anatomy to get it the way that it looked and the way it...
No, I never talked to Jack, and I don't think Jack very often articulated how he worked. I think Jack was kind of an instinctual art. I've got an interview coming out that an article actually Gil Kane wrote back in '74, and he talks a lot about his influences, in particular guys like Kurtzman, and there's a lot about Kirby in there, and so forth. And he talks about certain people that he feels, and that are naturals, and certain people that are sort of build up their talent. He even feels like Hal Foster's one of these people who wasn't a natural but built it up. I don't know if that's right or what. But obviously one of the great naturals was Jack Kirby. It was an interesting thing that Gil observed that I thought was interesting. You would still look back at it, 40-something years after Gil wrote the article. It's still true. Gil would say that there are a lot of people, they would accept Jack's anatomy on a story. I don't mean just Stan, but anybody over the years, they would accept his anatomy, his version of the way he saw things, and those same people would reject some drawing of his for the anatomy. And it wasn't like he was bragging because he thought his anatomy was better, although he had studied it more and was always practicing. And Jack just drew whatever, you got the feeling but whatever was in there. Stan always said about Jack, he said, he says, Kurt, he can't fix anything. He was willing to. If Stan wanted to redraw something, he'd redraw something. It was just a case of redrawing it. But if you wanted Jack to fix a leg on one of his characters or a hand and do something a little different, Stan was never happy with it. And it's because I think that Jack saw it in his head this one way and he put it down. And if Stan didn't like that, Jack didn't really... he wasn't just some guy who could just, turn the hand this way or do that. You're better off getting a John Romita or somebody to actually just draw a new hand than you are trying to get Jack Kirby to fix his old one, and everything. The funny thing is that I don't, as much as I respect both men, I don't think Jack and Stan ever really understood each other. I think I understood more about them from watching them, and I'm sure I'm not alone there, than Stan and Jack understood about each other, and so, because I was a lot less surprised, when Jack quit, and so were a lot of other people, than Stan was, because other people knew that and I'm sure it must have got back to Stan, that Jack would go off to lunch or this and that and just rage, about his feelings about Stan and everything. Not these little dinners with me and Romita, these people, but in other places. And yet, somehow or other, Stan sort of thought that, well, now that we got this thing, it's a Stan Lee Jack Kirby production, which was Jack's idea for the wording. It wasn't like something Stan imposed on him. He thought maybe he had settled the problem, but he just put the cork in the volcano until the next time it flew. And when you get a person with a really strong viewpoint like him, or even Ditko, who just walked in one day and quit and went to work at Charlton for much lower rates, well, when people have that kind of artistic temperament, you just have to accept the fact it's not that they're right or they're wrong. They just have a temperament that forces them to do something like that. And to me, the amazing thing is that for a little over 100 issues, Stan and Jack worked together and produced what Gil in his article calls, he said, the most sustained, excellent performance I've seen in comics. And you could argue, you can't find many other things where for 50, 100 issues, even if it was falling off that last couple of years, you're not going to find any long, sustained performances like that by, you could say, okay, 60 or 70 issues, Sikowski doing Justice League, but all that was good. There was nothing on a plane with that. It was just a competent job. But Jack was, at the very worst, super competent and and often inspired.
You mentioned the Fantastic Four, that amazing run, and as a young kid in the 70s, I was reading Marvel's Greatest Comics and getting those reprints, not Fantastic Four, which was going on at the time, and I had no desire to read that or look at it simply because I loved what Jack did. And, taking the Thing and bringing him to a planet so he could fight, and it was Torgo was the guy he was fighting, and all that stuff was just so magical. And I remember watching Thundar the Barbarian when that cartoon came on, and I'm like, oh my God, this is a Jack Kirby comic book come to life with super science and all sorts of other weird things that I don't understand. Do you see a lot of I don't know what you're seeing or reading now.
We just have a minute left, so I
yes.
can see it fast.
So, do you see a lot of Jack Kirby's work and his style still prevalent prevalent in the industry today?
Well, I don't see that much. I think less so than it used to be. But I like that description of that title that they use, that my publisher John Morrow uses in his Jack Kirby Collector, where he has somebody writes an article called Kirby is a Genre. And that's pretty close to right, but I don't think it's quite as much now. He's still an influence. But, there aren't as many artists who look like Jack Kirby, and it's a little more subtle because the storytelling has changed. I mean, Jack would have told one story, and nowadays that comic, there'd be a novel length of Gone with the Wind by the time you told the same story in a comic book that nowadays that Jack would tell, and the other old-time artists would tell in a 20-page story. You'd have to gather together and read for a year to find the same story.
So I don't want you to destroy the myth, but I may ask you this, and maybe you'll have to destroy the myth. Did you see him smoking cigars like he is depicted doing all the time?
Oh, he smoked cigars, sure.
In my head, I see him just one after another.
Oh, he always did from the earliest days when he and Joe Simon both smoked them in the office. He was always working with a cigar. He doesn't light and smoke around the office, but he smokes a cigar, and he often had, I saw him with one quite a few times. Stan was the one who used it as a prop and never actually lit it. He was a guy for this, that, but he almost never, we had a little while where he and Saul Brasky and I Stan started little cigarillos or whatever. But even that just last couple, Stan really wasn't a smoker. He just thought it made him look sophisticated, and so he did it. Jack actually smoked the damn thing. Oh yeah, Jack. When Jack quit, they put up a memorial Jack Kirby stogie or something on the wall. Well, anyway, thank you very much. And anything we said about Jack, please know, that anything I said is written with a tremendous respect for Kirby as a man, as an artist. Everybody has his faults, his foibles, and you can argue about what they are. But Jack was one of the handful of supremely talented people come out of the field, one of the biggest influences. And I'm only sorry that that I, instead of he, is up here today to tell you to celebrate his 100th birthday. I wish he was doing it himself.
That would be awesome, 100 years.
Yeah.
He might have gotten lost coming up here too.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been an Earplug Podcast presentation. Found on earplugpodcast.com, iTunes, SoundCloud, and wherever your favorite podcasts are found.